All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Frank Ledwidge. He was a lieutenant commander in British Naval Intelligence, and he served in Afghanistan, and we've talked with him on the show before about his time in the Helmand province. And if you read my books, I'm pretty sure he's in both of them, in the Afghanistan part of Enough Already and in Fool's Errand. And he wrote his own books, Investment in Blood, The True Cost of Britain's Afghan War, and Losing Small Wars, British Military Failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. Welcome back to the show, Frank. How are you?
Scott, it, as always, is an absolute privilege to be with you. I've been listening to your show for the last decade or so, and it's great to be on.
Oh, wow. That's really great to hear. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the privilege of having you here. And so do I have this right, that you are just back from Ukraine?
Yep, that's right. I got back just a couple of weeks ago. I was there just for a week this time. And over the last 2 years, I've probably spent about 3 months there on and off, looking at what's going on and seeing how things are essentially, as you know very well, going downhill now.
Mm-hmm. Just as a tourist, or you're advising somebody over there, or what are you doing?
Last time I was at a conference organised by the Army. I was talking about space because I teach space in my day work, which is as an academic at Portsmouth University. But obviously, you know, when you're there, you pick up very easily, because I have quite a few friends, and even you don't even need friends. You pick up very easily the atmosphere. And it was quite different, it's fair to say, than what has been before. Not only that, you know, you pick up bits and pieces of information which, let's say, lead you to believe that things are not as they would like it to be, to put it mildly. And you also begin to get a feel, really, as you know yourself. I mean, I know you've been involved in Ukraine, your wife's Ukraine and what have you, so you know this much better than I do. But the way that people live, and the society is not, of course, a Swiss-like democracy where everything works and what gets said gets done. And a lot of the media that we're fed concerning people's views is also not quite on message when you talk to people, specifically concerning recruitment and especially, Scott, casualties. That's what you pick up there, is the sense that everybody knows somebody who's been killed or seriously injured. And it's very apparent, you know, on the trains and in the streets, especially when you move out of the centre of Kiev, where most journalists hang out, the level of damage that's been done to people, as well as things. Obviously, there's not much damage in the centre of Kiev. But also, you don't get any sense in the centre of Kiev, where, as I say, most visitors hang out, that you're at a country at war. You know, very few uniforms. You see the patrols of the army going around, presence patrols, like you would in a sort of peacekeeping mission, or that. But otherwise, everyone's getting on with life, including, I might say, very many young men, many hundreds or thousands of which are swanning around very happily in their SUVs or from bar to bar. So there's not that sense that you would expect of an embattled nation. That's, of course, different in other places, and the closer you get to the front. But Kiev, absolutely not at all.
Let me just clarify the one thing there with the comparison to the Swiss. And you're saying, it sounds like you're saying when a bureaucrat tells his underling to do a thing, the system doesn't work. In other words, the government there is so corrupt that it's just completely broken and doesn't really do what it's supposed to do at all. Or
you get a sense that the more you go, the more dysfunctional central government is. And I mean, just for example, within defence, there's a very clear conflict between the Ministry of Defence, which is quite fractious, and the military, which is quite fractious, and the various organisations within the military, not least, of course, famous military intelligence, the GUR. And some of this is at cross purposes. So, for example, the firing of General Zaluzhny, who was very popular amongst the army, as it obviously didn't go down very well, and the replacement with this sort of Soviet-type Syrskyi, who's in charge now, reflected very deep divisions, not only within the Ministry of Defence and the army, but the government itself. And my understanding that Zaluzhny was seen by the government as a threat to Zelensky, whose shine is coming off a little bit right now. But yeah, just to go back to your point, obviously Ukraine is an incredibly corrupt country. And again, one of my friends is an army officer, and I asked this officer when she was going to be promoted, and essentially the answer was either when I can purchase my commission, like the British did in the sort of 1870s, or stopped doing that actually, or when somebody gets killed or dies and I move into that position. I was talking to an American, just a little couple of vignettes here, and we were talking about who's lived there for 20 or 30 years, American guy, very easygoing, very realistic, obviously closely connected with the Ukrainians. It just told me straight out, it costs $50,000 to buy your generalship, so you have to get that money back. And I think anybody who goes near the military and isn't shepherded, that's to say people who go down on the line, and you'll have heard all this before, or go near the line and talk to people frankly, see the sort of mayhem that goes down there. It reminds me actually, Scott, quite a bit of the Balkans. I was in Bosnia during the bad days, in Kosovo, and what you'd get there is one unit renting out to another some shells or even some artillery or some guys. And you see that in Ukraine as well. And you think 2 years on they'd have got a grip on this, but that's not the case. So, for example, you see around collection boxes for this or that brigade, and what they're trying to do is raise money to buy an SUV or a car, even to transport themselves backwards and forwards to the front. And again, I'll just to stress another point. When you're in Kiev, there are no shortages of cars or SUVs, rather nice and shiny ones that run rather well. But these guys on the front who are being wrecked by artillery need to transport their people to the casualty receiving station, have to buy second-hand SUVs, have them transported in from the West, or indeed just ordinary cars if that's all they can get. A lot of the Ukrainian military, and obviously it's the same in Russia, I would think, but a lot of the Ukrainian military is actually it's underfunded, obviously undermanned, which we could get to, and to some extent dysfunctional. I mean, I met one guy, foreign, in the Foreign Legion, one of the Foreign Legion units. As you know, Ukraine operates this Foreign Legion system. I don't know how many people are in it. Some people say 5,000, some say 20. Anyway, there are thousands of foreigners who join this. Many of them, even most, I think, well-intentioned. But they have to buy their own kit. And what this guy I was talking to was a commander of a brigade or whatever. It wouldn't be a few dozen men, really. And he ended up coming home, or coming across to Europe, buying a security van, which is vaguely bulletproof, and bringing that back for a few $1,000s because he'd raised the money, because it's better than nothing in an artillery saturated environment. So, the closer you get to it, and I didn't get in any way close to the front, but spoke to people all the time who were, the less the image of a well-funded, well-armed Western-style army, which obviously becomes very apparent. It's not like that to a very great degree.
And I'm sorry to go back to the beginning here, but I just wanted to be clear for people because, especially because of your experience and all that, you mentioned attending that conference but you are not part in any way of this Foreign Legion for the last 2 years. Serving as a contractor or an advisor, anything to any of these in any official position or any mercenary or contractor type position.
No, I spent a few weeks as dealing with a project back in June 22. But I was also there in a sort of academic capacity as well. But no, I'm not involved in the Legion or anything like that. But I will say, I was very pro, and still am very pro Ukraine. It's just that you begin to see that the war that you believed in, and I changed my approach about a year ago. There comes a point where the losses that are being sustained don't justify any potential gains. And I teach this kind of stuff in my academic life. And to see it happen, that where there's no reasonable prospect of success insofar as you can define success, you have to question whether it's worth, or put another way, whether the time may have come, and perhaps we can get on to this, to think about settling it.
Yeah. Well, I've done this long enough now that I'm beginning to see a pattern here, Frank.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, the difference between the image that's conveyed to us until really recently, including on your show, over the last few months, it's just, the gap is just, it's a chasm now. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to some NATO officials a couple of months ago, and asked them what they thought the fatal casualties sustained by Ukraine were, how many killed. And they said 20,000.
Are you kidding?
20,000. No, yeah, right, that's what I said. Are you kidding? Is it serious? I said, yes, we've just come back from Kiev and we're confident it's 20,000. And I said, yeah, last year we had the Discord leaks, which said 70,000, then confirmed by US Congress. Milley said something similar to that. That's a year ago. And you're telling me 20,000 now. And they said, yes, we're confident now. Well, of course, a couple of weeks later, Zelensky upped that to 31,000. But here's the thing, Scott. When I was there last time, we're looking at 3 weeks ago now, I talked to a friend of mine who's got very good connections with the general staff. I mean, really good official connections and unofficial. And I said, please don't, I won't use the term I use, but just tell me straight, what level of casualties are you at? And this person before had been very blunt with me about other stuff, about losses and gains and injuries and so on. And this character said, same as the Russians. And I said, same as the Russians? Yes, same as the Russians. I said, what's your source there? She told me, which was, the general staff. So there you have it. And of course, now they're looking for 500,000 new people, which doesn't really stand with the kind of levels of casualties that we've been told.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me, Frank, what does that mean, actually? Because both sides lie about their own casualties and both sides inflate the other sides. So I never know what to believe, man. What do you think?
Well, BBC put out something which was quite interesting 2 weeks ago, I think, or certainly last month. And they said that they could identify 70,000 Russian dead. I don't know if that's practical in terms of numbers, but that would live with at least the kind of order of magnitude that we're talking about the Ukrainians. US Congress last year said 500,000 casualties, twice as many Russian than Ukrainian. Frankly, you know what? Over the last year, I'd tend more to the 50-50, given that Ukraine was trying to push forward for a long time. And of course, Russia has had artillery dominance for a long time. It's an attritional war. They've got drone dominance. They've got electronic warfare dominance. They've got control of the air for the most part. They've been malleting the Ukrainians with these bombs for these glide bombs for the last year. Again, that's only become apparent in the last few months, but Ukrainian officials or people involved with the army were telling me a year ago these are a really big problem. That's what kicked them out of Bakhmut. That's what the decisive factor was, I understand, in Avdiivka back in February with these glide bombs. And they're a problem because the Ukrainians haven't got the air defences to hit them, as we all know. And the reason they've not got those now is, I think, this is my assessment, but it's reasonably well based, they've run out of the Russian systems that were doing a lot of damage to the Russian Air Force and stopping a lot of the missiles coming into the country. They've run out of those, so they're entirely dependent now on Western stuff, as I think they've said. And that's not coming at the kind of rate they need. And the consequence is, therefore, that Russian aircraft near what they call the zero line have far more freedom to hit them with these bombs. The only countermeasure, apparently, were the Patriots, But the Russians started hitting those as well, which is why I suspect the Americans are very reluctant now to send any more systems there.
Yeah, I guess it just takes, a certain salvo of glide bombs in a row before you take out the Patriot launcher itself, right?
Yeah. I remember talking to a NATO anti-aircraft officer, and he said, look, the Russians aren't stupid. They know what we're doing. They work it out. It doesn't take long for them to develop countermeasures for us. And that's what they did with the Patriots on the line. And so the Ukrainians had to withdraw them, with the result that now Russian aircraft have not quite free rein, because they do have some opposition on the line, but a lot more freedom than they had before. And just to put this into context, so everyone talks about the shells all the time. So 152 millimeter shell, which is the Russian shells, they weigh about 45 kilos. So what's that? 90 pounds. And the Russians are dropping 1,000 kilo bombs on them, which is 2,000 pounds on target. And you don't recover from that. That isn't the kind of thing that you can hide from. It will just dig a hole 50 feet deep and 100 feet wide, and that's the end of you and all your colleagues. So it's a completely different order of magnitude than artillery. And they're using thousands of these things.
Yeah. And now, just to be clear, I guess, for people who don't read about this all day, this essentially, it's almost like a JDAM kit, right? It's a guidance kit on an old bomb from an old Soviet warehouse, right?
Yeah, exactly right. It's a jury rig JDAM essentially, and they pin on. Like I say, they're not stupid. They're clever. They can improvise, which is what soldiers and airmen are supposed to do. And they stick a GPS guidance kit on it. They fold that into a glide kit, put it on a bomb, and there you have your JDAM, or paveways as we call them. They've also got, so that's the FAB bombs. They also got KAB bombs, which are exactly the same as our JDAMs. They're got integrated systems. Either way, you're in trouble if one comes near you. And there's no countermeasure now to those. So they've been probably the biggest single factor in Avdiivka and Bakhmut in these very important battles. But then, of course, the first-person view drones and the artillery itself. And, it's First World War stuff, Scott. I was talking to another guy who I asked him, had he considered joining the army? He said he had considered it, got 3 kids, so that kind of affected him. But he said, it's good pay on zero. He said those were his exact words in English. On zero, it's good pay. It's 100,000 hryvnia, he said, which is quite a lot. It's like $2,500, something like that. But he said you just get that for 3 days, and then you have to go to the hospital. Now, I'm sure that's the case on some parts of the front, probably some quiet parts of the front it isn't. But the point is, that's the kind of thing that was going on in the First World War during the trenches, which informs the level of casualties that I think is going on there, which then informs this question of how just it is to carry on at the rate it is carrying on.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's get right to that point, because there's so many other things we can talk about, but that's sort of the overall thing here, is you're saying surrender now before it's worse, which is such a horrible, cowardly, cut and run thing to say, when the other side of the narrative, Frank, is that they want to fight, so we have to help them fight to the last man if they're willing to. But then I guess you got conscription and all that, which calls into question the willingness of these fighters. But, that's the way the Democrats see it anyway.
Yeah, but they're not surrendering, are they? Because they've won their war now. They've preserved their independence. It's highly likely that, depending on how it's negotiated, they'll preserve between 70 and 90% or 70 and 80% of their territory. They'll have the support of the West. They'll have EU funding coming out of their ears for the next 10, 20 years to repair the wreckage that's been caused. And that's if they stop now, or if there's some form of advance to negotiation now. If they don't do that, it's only going to get worse. You hear constantly now, very bluntly now, and I'm surprised at this after the congressional award to them, but even now you're starting to hear senior Ukrainian officers saying there's no military path to victory for us alone. In fact, somebody said that in the last couple of days. It may have been Siersky, the command, may have been somebody else, but certainly it was, all this is open source stuff. And in that circumstance, you say, well, okay then. Well, you're taking let's say 1,000 casualties a day, including injured. And for what?
Well, yeah, good question. And look, I think people have been saying this all along, and maybe predicting an earlier Ukrainian defeat, but still saying that obviously the manpower and the financial power and the just raw artillery shell production capability is all on Russia's side here. It's like Texas versus the United States. We'd put up a hell of a fight, but at the end of the day, what are we going to do against the entire rest of the Union, basically, right?
Right, and it's an attritional war. And the center of gravity of attrition, as you indicated before, is manpower. And they've said they're going to recruit 500,000 men. And as Colonel Davis says constantly, and he knows about these things a lot more than I do, or Colonel McGregor, for whom I have a great deal of time, you're creating an army, right? Even if you can recruit half of that, you have to train them. And they're not getting any training. I mean, look, just to take a slight digression, it's not appealing for young men to be told or hauled into a force where you're going to be given a few weeks training at most, put in the back of an armoured personnel carrier, thrown in a trench because they just dump them in trenches, but that's the way they have to do it, otherwise they'll be hit by drones, and then shelled by Russian artillery. That's not appealing. But let's assume you can get people to volunteer for whatever pay they get, which is a fraction of what the Russian soldiers get, by the way, because they, at the very least, pay their soldiers properly, or they contract soldiers properly. Let's say you can recruit 200,000. How are you going to train them all? Who's going to train them? You then have to form them into units. Then you have to form those units into the system of systems, an integrated system of systems. And an army that big has to be if it's going to successfully act against the Russians. Now, just to put that into context, well, the West say, oh, well, we'll train thousands of men. Well, the British train 5,000 people every 3 months. And by the way, their trainers are told, don't make friends with these people because they're very likely not to be with us in the next few weeks. And that's the British. The Americans slightly more. The Germans do 10,000 a year. I think this is a drop in the ocean. And then you get the saber wavers who say, well, we should deploy trainers in Ukraine. And that's seriously being proposed now by certainly British politicians. And you hear, of course, the chihuahuas of the Baltic states constantly clamouring to go and even fight. And that's where we get a ratchet that becomes dangerous, Scott, to us all for reasons you know very well. You know, you've wrote hotter than the sun, and you know very well the consequences of doing what none of our Cold War leaders did for nearly 50 years, which was put Western soldiers within combat range of Russian ones.
Yeah, I recently saw, I'm pretty sure it was Joe Scarborough, but it was somebody representing the consensus saying, come on, doesn't anyone remember the Cold War when we stood up to the commies? And it's like, well, but in the Cold War, Ike stood by and did nothing when the Soviets cracked down in Hungary. And LBJ did nothing when the Soviets cracked down in Czechoslovakia. And Reagan did nothing. And by the way, in all three cases, it was the CIA had kind of stirred them on in the first place. And I meant to say, to finish there, in Poland, when Solidarity started up and all that, and they cracked down, the local Polish communists cracked down on Solidarity, Reagan said, good luck, guys. We'll see you in 10 years, but we're not going to intervene on the other side of the line. So how is... But they just invoked the Cold War like what happened was Ronald Reagan was elected president right after FDR, and he stomped over there and he beat Stalin up, and it's been peace on earth ever since.
Yeah, but what you're failing to see, Scott, you see, is that what will happen if we let the Russians stop at some unnamed town in anonymous town in eastern Ukraine and draw the line there, is that the next thing they'll be in Riga, and then after that they'll be in Berlin or Warsaw, on the Dover coast or on the Channel coast. That's what's going to happen, you see. Save, of course, that isn't what's going to happen, because you've covered these things before, but let's just say this. The kind of schizophrenia of all this was laid bare, and I read your very own, that is to say the Americans' very own, it's called the National Threat Assessment, which is the consensus of 17 intelligence agencies. You can imagine the kind of squabbling that goes on over that. And they said, and I quote, Russia almost certainly does not, this is March this year, a direct military conflict with the US and NATO forces. Well, how does that live with all the rhetoric about, well, we've got to arm ourselves to the teeth to defend Estonia? I don't see that.
Yeah, well, and speaking of Estonia, I hope I don't have this wrong, but isn't that the Baltic state with the most ethnic Russians living in it, and with the most concern about potential conflict of having the Russians move their border a little bit west to take back their lost city and this kind of thing? I forgot the name of it. I was just reading about this pretty recently.
Latvia's got the most Russians in it, but Estonia's a close second. It's about 15 to 20%, and they're all concentrated in this city called Narva. which is very near St. Petersburg. It's like less than an hour's drive, I think. But, what's the consequences of them? First of all, they've never claimed Narva, as far as I know. They've no interest in it, or any other part of Estonia or Finland or any of these other countries. Secondly, they know what would happen if they did that. Third, if they couldn't take a city and can't take a city of 30,000 people, or it takes them a year to do it, in some anonymous part of Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of troops on call, heavy artillery superiority, air power superiority, and it takes them a year to do it. Against NATO, what do they think is going to happen? And that's why the national threat assessment fully, and the 17 agencies, when they're talking honestly, fully understand that Russia has no ambitions and does the last thing it wants is a direct fight with NATO, because they know what will happen. Well, for what reason? To do what? What would be a strategic objective in doing something like that?
Okay, but Frank, the ladies at the Atlantic Council and the Marshall Fund, they say that you just admitted that they can be beaten. It's so hard for them to even take one town. Why can't we just tilt the war back in Ukraine's favor, which they think at one point it was in, I guess?
I think we've rather tried that, but let's see.
And I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound just too sexist about that. I was referring to a debate recently between Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, and John Mearsheimer versus the ladies from the Atlantic Council and the Marshall Fund and the Council on Foreign Relations, who were very sure that this could be going fine, Frank, if we would just give them enough HIMARS.
I saw that debate. It was a bit like a tiger against a rabbit, really, wasn't it? If you were to look at it objectively. It was embarrassing on their part. I didn't quite understand their point, because, of course, the first thing is we have given them all those weapons. The Russians have developed countermeasures. And secondly, and equally importantly, you need highly trained troops to do that, guard them, take and hold the land that you're going to gain. And we armed the Ukrainians, and or at least we said we'd done so. And we, of course, guaranteed them everything they wanted this time last year, and they had all they said that they wanted, and they took 7 miles of land. We've done what we can. It's very clear that the US military establishment, let's be candid, is not interested in having Ukraine be equipped to win this. So I'll give you just one figure. Yesterday, Blinken was in Kiev, and he said, we're trying to find some Patriot systems to give you. Trying to find. The US has 40 batteries of, 80 batteries. Each battery is composed of all the radars plus at least 8 launchers. They have 480 launchers. Man, if they can't find a launcher or two, or even a battery or two, somebody should be having a word with US Army Logistics, because there are 480 launchers they can give, but they're not giving them. Why not? Because we need those things, Scott, to go and fight China. That's why. And same for all the thousands of armoured vehicles, artillery, and all the other things in reserve. We gave them enough to hold and to have a go. It didn't work out. We're going to give them enough now to push it past the election and see what happens, and land it on someone else's plate.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, so to change the subject to China for a second here, in a way this is, I think there's kind of a fight. I'm sure you guys talk about this in the UK as well. That the sort of disagreement, it seems like, was before we take on China, what do we do about Russia? And one argument, which was Trump's argument and Kissinger's argument, and a few other of the realists, was we should befriend Putin. We should figure out how to share responsibilities and power with Putin and get along with him to try to split him away from China. And it seems like in the Biden government, the neoconservatives and the more hawkish neoliberals, their policy was no, we'll provoke and bait Russia. We'll give them a hard ass time, and they'll be too bogged down dealing with our crap in Eastern Europe to be any good help to China. And then it seems like that's the policy that won out, but that ultimately this is about containing China, or worse, fighting them. What do you think about all that crap?
Well, I'm with John Mearsheimer in this. What we've managed to do is defeat what should have been our main grand strategic objective, which was to try and pull Russia onto our side in what he regards as the sort of existential fight, as it were, against China. Now, I don't know if there's an existential fight, but it certainly seems a bad idea to me to alienate one great power, let's call them, not a superpower, and push them over not only to ally, as we see today in Beijing, where Putin is, at least when we speak, but also provide China with all the oil and gas they could ever want to cut prices. That's probably a mistake, I would have said, but hey, what do I know? Even if you accept that China is a massive threat to you. And surely, as Mearsheimer would say, what you would prefer, what might be rather preferable to do, might be to, in the medium term, woo Russia and make sure that that didn't happen, and that the oil and gas that helps your economy doesn't go to your supposed enemies. And as for connecting the Ukraine war with Taiwan, I just don't see any relevant link at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, their link is that if we don't go all the way to the nth degree in Ukraine, then that signals to China that they can do whatever they want in Taiwan.
Yeah. Well, if we do go to the nth degree in Ukraine, we'll end up in a nuclear war. So that doesn't, that's the only solution to this. There's no way, there's no path, as indeed the Ukrainian commander-in-chief is reported to have said in the last few days, there is no military path to victory for us alone. But that implies that there may be a military path if we get some friends on side. If we get some friends on side, that's where NATO troops face off against Russian troops, and we know where that goes. Because up to now, what we've had is a ratcheting of escalation, and that ratchet does not have a pattern of going down, and we know where that ratchet ends.
People say to me, Scott, how do you get so much work done all the time? Coffee. It helps keep me from falling asleep. And it tastes really good because I get it from Moondo's Artisan Coffee at moondosartisancoffee.com. Moondo's is kind of the anti-Starbucks in that their coffee tastes real good. They have lots of great choices, representing all kinds of regions, blends, and flavors. I'm drinking the Ethiopian presently. Hey, wait, also, do you like saving money on good tasting coffee? Right now you can get 10% off and help support this show if you just go to moondosartisancoffee.com/Horton. Find the link and the QR code in the margin at scotthorton.org. That's moondosartisancoffee.com/Horton. Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house, so I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up. Well, folks, sad to say, they lied us into war. All of them. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq War I, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq War II, Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of them. But now you can get the ebook, All the War Lies, by me for free. Just sign up for the email list at the bottom of the page at scotthorton.org or go to scotthorton.org/subscribe. Get All the War Lies by me for free. And then you'll never have to believe them again. Yeah. It does seem a lot of times too simple-minded. Like the politicians, and the strategists, I guess, themselves too, they just get trapped in what they said before. Even probably when they know that they're kind of lying or they're leaving out important context about maybe their role in helping precipitate a thing. Like if I get into a fist fight and I know that it was like kind of my fault, even if it was more the other guy's fault, like I could just grandstand and pretend it was all the other guy's fault, or I could be slightly conciliatory since I know that I did play my own role in the conflict too. I'm oversimplifying things, but they don't ever seem to think that way. They seem to be absolutely imprisoned by whatever their propaganda line of the day is, which Putin is Stalin or he's Hitler and he's pure evil and it's pure aggression, as you referred to before. He's coming for Latvia next. If we don't stop him here, we're going to... It's like giving Xi a permission slip to go to Taiwan if we don't, and that's just the way they really believe it. It seems like they're not just kind of putting us on, which, I mean, so what you just said then is the problem is there's not, other than a real regime change in the United States or Britain, it doesn't sound like there's a real smart way out of this, because it would have to include probably saying, look, Putin does have some points or something. You know what I mean? There's got to be a room to compromise over.
Well, you would think so, but perhaps they'll sort that out in the Geneva Peace Conference in the next couple of weeks, where everyone's invited. A couple of dozen countries are showing up except Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, look, Andrew Coburn has the answer for all this. or much of it, doesn't he? When he talks about, let's be candid about it, it's in some people's interest to keep this damn thing going, and that's where things get really dark, in my view.
Yeah. I read, I guess it was this old article by Scott McConnell about George Kennan and what he had said, not just warning against NATO expansion, but this quote I wasn't familiar with before, where, I mean, it's obvious enough, but it's just interesting coming from him and quotable coming from him, that, having another Cold War with Russia is almost certain to end in a real nuclear war. The thing that we did everything in the world to avoid, and we successfully avoided, and then somehow, do you remember when they made Terminator 2? And it was after the Cold War was over. So now how are you going to explain the whole nuclear war thing, right? And so when the Terminator explains it to the kid says, Russia nukes us, but aren't we friends with them now? Which is like, even though that's like the childish understanding, like that should have been the end all of everything. If we're friends with the Russians at all, if that whole thing is over now, well, then there's nothing more important in the entire world there couldn't possibly be than staying friends with them forever.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
what are we talking about? It's
everything
crazy.
you wrote in Hotter Than the Sun. And you probably read Anne Jacobson's book, Nuclear War, and I didn't know about this, and you did know about Proud Prophet. Every scenario involving some kind of nuclear use, whatever it is, demonstration or full on mad, it all ends the same way. And if there's a 1% chance of that, that's too much damn chance.
Yep.
And that's why when you said there's nothing more important in the whole world, I'm absolutely with you. We should not mess with this. And that's, I think, enough said on that particular point. Yeah. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Proud Prophet, the exercise in '83, where Schelling and all his crew ran through all the scenarios they could find, and every one of them ended up in civilization-ending mayhem.
Yep. And it's just use them or lose them. And I mean, the basic doctrine is it's slightly oversimplified, but basically the deal is deterrence doesn't work unless we really mean it, that we will launch everything we've got at you, but then it's no good as a bluff. It has to really be real, which means if anybody calls the bluff, then that's it. As Jacobson puts it in the book there, the president's menu of nuclear war options are extremely limited, and it's the same for the other sides too. Once you start nuking Chinese start nuking back, right? Same with the Russians, and that's it.
Yeah, and I play those games occasionally with military colleagues. Part of my job involves that. And I mean, they're very quick, very short war games. But when the question comes, do we or do we not get involved in this? Do we or do we not press the button? It's a 50-50. Even then, when all the consequences are explained to them in detail and firmly, there's always 50. And it's not because they're military. Actually, civilians in tests like this have shown themselves rather more willing to use them. But either way, it's between 50 and 60% say yes. Otherwise, deterrent. We've demonstrated that for 70 years that deterrence didn't work. Yeah. So we have to show that deterrence does work. So yes, we'll send that missile on its way to Kaliningrad or whatever airbase we've selected, and even against the threat that anything like that will result in a city going. Yeah. Yes, fine. We understand that. Well, then we'll do the same to their cities, and on it goes. And you always get 50 to 60%, sometimes fractionally less, but regularly a majority saying, yes, do it. Retaliate for that.
And for anyone who hasn't read Annie Jacobson's book yet, like, put your fingers in your ears because I'm going to ruin it for you. And see, the book is based on all interviews of secretaries of defense and generals and admirals and SAC commanders and every other thing and the highest level experts. And so it's a realistic portrayal of how they would react and what they would do. And essentially, when the Russians nuke America over what the Americans know is a misunderstanding, that the Russians think we're nuking them when really we're just nuking North Korea. And they have to know that the Russians mistakenly, but honestly mistakenly, think that we're nuking them. It's proposed. Well, maybe we should just take it on the chin, because what are we going to do? We're going to kill all these people when we're dead anyway, and they didn't really do anything. Their government, or the people didn't, and the government at least is making an honest mistake, and we know it. Nope. Overruled. We launch anyway. We kill them all anyway, because we're not just going to leave the earth for the Russians to inherit without us, are we?
God damn it, victory's victory.
Yeah. And then, so I guess she's interviewing secretaries of defense who are saying, yep, that's how it would go, right? She's getting that from Leon Panetta and Robert Gates. They're saying, that's right, Annie Jacobson. That's what we would do. We would kill them all for no reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you see the NASA experiment? I think it was done by, obviously it was done by computer, where they looked at a war between India and Pakistan, using 100 warheads, each of about 20 kilotons. Anyway, fair old bunch of warheads. And they played the climate results out over 2 years. And in the Northern Hemisphere, more than 50% of the crops would die. So you've got famine, which, I mean, and he talks about this, of course, in a different experiment. But whatever parameters you use, this one just covers a localized nuclear war between two nuclear armed forces, essentially. So 100 warheads in a confined area, and still you've got between 2 and 4 billion people dying.
Yep. And you know, it's funny how normalized this all is. In fact, when I put out that book, like, this is, I don't know, it's really notable to me, I guess. The subtitle is Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, because that's how I do with my subtitles. It's time to stop doing this and stop doing that, like occupying Afghanistan or the rest of the terror war. So going with that theme. But the book is all about nukes and all about every country's nuclear weapons programs or not, and all of these different things. But so whatever, man, I made my point in the subtitle, because that's what I'm really trying to kind of alert people to, is the danger of these things overall, and I really do think they should be abolished. But man, I might as well have said that you have to start trolling the gay bar now and taking puberty blockers and voting for Democrats, and like, I didn't say that. You're saying we should just surrender to Russia and China and let them conquer us? I didn't say that, right? And the idea that Ronald Reagan thought this could be done. They've never heard of that. It just sounds like what I'm saying is America should kill itself and let all of our enemies destroy us. And let Osama bin Laden's ghost take over D.C. or whatever, right? That's what it means to abolish nukes, is to be helpless, is what people think. And worse, like feminine, you know, something they could never countenance. And so, like, anyone who knows anything about defense knows that this is how it has to be for the rest of the history of humanity, is a permanent Mexican standoff with these national governments holding hydrogen bombs to each other's heads. And there is no other alternative to that other than, what are you saying, one world communism under the Ayatollah, or you know what I mean? Whatever.
Yeah.
And that's what we're up against, is that kind of, people don't even want to hear it at all. In fact, a friend told me he was turning on his army buddy to it, and his army buddy said, what's this about abolishing nukes? I'm not reading this guy's book about the war on terrorism if he thinks we should abolish nukes. Like, all of a sudden, I'm Noam Chomsky, right? Yeah.
It's been really successfully suppressed, hasn't it? You know, in the 80s and even early 90s, certainly the 70s, there was very strong arguments against this. And there were public arguments made by the most credible people, and sometimes the most surprising people. I mean, I've heard arguments made like that, by the way, you know, against nuclear weapons by very senior military officers who know exactly what the consequences of having these, because of course, Scott, as most of your listeners will know, we in Britain, we have to have nuclear weapons as well, because we have to be big and strong too, just like the French and you guys and the Russians. So we spend, I think, between 7 and 10% of our defence budget on keeping 4 rackety submarines floating around the North Atlantic with nuclear bombs on them, on the basis, of course, that for the next 30 years, when we get the new ones, that 17,000 tons of steel, space rockets, nuclear reactors and people will be undetectable under 500 or 1,000 feet of water. Really?
Yeah. Well, and you know, speaking of which, how much of this is about competition over the Arctic Circle, which obviously Russia's northern coastline completely dominates? The North Pole.
Well, they've got, so part of that coastline is called, they have their bastion there, and that's where they keep their ballistic missile submarines. So right now, I think we can be fairly certain, because this has been happening for the last 50 years. There are American, British and French submarines sneaking around up there looking for the Russian ballistic missile submarines, which are guarded by all their military assets. So that's a start. That's a big part of the naval campaign over the Arctic Circle. And then, of course, as you know, fact there is, over the last decade or so, there have been huge new oil and gas fields discovered there under the ice, and we can now get to that oil and gas, which is one reason why the Russians spend a lot of time putting little flags at the bottom of the sea. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, so let's talk about what's going on in Ukraine more. What about the latest from the Russian offensive near Kharkiv? Are they really taking it now? I heard the debate that, no, they're just exhausting Ukrainian reserves and taking their time.
Yeah, well, I think they're doing what they said they were going to do. And I think that's going to be the pattern. Putin has declared as a minimal objective in Donetsk and Luhansk. In due course, I think it might take him a while if the Ukrainians don't break. And Putin said back in March, right, tell you what now, because of this chaotic blunder into the Belgorod district by Russian renegades, what we're going to do is we're going to build a cordon sanitaire a few kilometers deep on the Ukrainian side, and that's what they're doing. So right now that it's very clear that that's how it's developing, and they may decide to extend that up to the northwest in Sumy, which is in the top right of Ukraine. There's no evidence, I think, that they're going to take Kharkiv with 40,000 people, including all the logistics. I mean, Kharkiv was fought over 3 times by the Russians and the Germans in the Second World War. It was completely flattened, and it took hundreds of thousands of casualties to take it each time. So I can't see the Russians trying to take that place. It would be a massive mistake. And anyway, they don't have the forces to do that deployed. So they've got a new division, I think, deployed near Kharkiv, which is feeding the forces now. Note, Scott, if you look at any of the footage around there, you don't see any or very few Russian tanks, because what you see are infantrymen in armored vehicles, some of them, not many, but they tend to be scaled for a few days in the field, and that's for reconnaissance units. So what they were doing is probing the defences, and what they found, by the way, as you know, is that these much vaunted Ukrainian defences either weren't there at all or were completely ineffective. And so in the words of one Ukrainian commander, they just walked through, which I would imagine they weren't expecting to do. But hey, who knows what they expected. So look, it looks to me like they're building that cordon sanitaire, that security zone, or whatever Putin calls it, as he said he was going to do 3 months ago. They're drawing away Ukrainian forces that have to stand ready. And whether or not they do have another go in Sumy, what they're doing is fixing Ukrainian forces. And the Ukrainian forces there can't be in 2 places at once, not even magic Ukrainian soldiers. And that's a win for them. Because all of these are new units, by the way, up there on the Belgorod front. It seems that from what the reports I've seen, they're new recruits, basically. And so reflecting, of course, the fact that Russia can recruit 20 or 30,000 people a month because they pay them, whereas Ukraine now, last week, announced it was going to conscript prisoners in. Hey, where have we had that before? Because things aren't going so well on the recruitment front. Anyway, the point is, I think this is going to be a security zone. They may move towards Kharkiv to threaten it, but look, Scott, I don't think they've got the forces to be able to threaten, let alone challenge for or take that huge city of 1.2 million people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it all depends on the strength of the Ukrainian military force there and whether they can stand, or are you saying that there'll be enough civilian resistance there as well?
I think that 40,000, if that's the number that's there, and I'd be fairly confident in that, because I would imagine it's informed by Western aerial intelligence and satellite intelligence. That you're looking there at only a proportion of combat troops. The Ukrainians, I think, could deploy that there. You need a 3-to-1 advantage in the assault. I can't imagine Ukrainians couldn't resist that. And also, you're going quite deep then in beyond your artillery and drone cover, which you need to establish. That's why they're moving quite slowly. I just don't think there's the forces to do that. They would need a much bigger force to do that. Mm-hmm. I just think they're going to establish the belt and see what happens. Now, it may well be. So these are reconnaissance units up to now, so a few battalions, perhaps a brigade. That's 5,000 or 6,000 troops worth at the moment being deployed, and Ukrainians haven't managed to push them back decisively. We'll see how that goes, but no, they just don't have the scale of forces yet to do that. Yet.
And so, I mean, on the map, they control virtually all of Luhansk, but only about half of Donetsk. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and however, and this is rarely reported, they're making advances every day in this area, in Donetsk province, in Donetsk Oblast. 500 meters here, a kilometer there, this village, this town. So the Ukrainians are being pushed back and back. I think what we may see over the next few weeks is a withdrawal to prepared lines, which this time one hopes will be prepared properly. And that'll be a moment that we will hear reported. But look, another thing, Scott, which is, like you, I talk to quite a lot of journalists, and I've spoken to journalists from two, I won't say who they are, two, because I would just put them into trouble, but two journalists who are really well informed about all this stuff, go down to the lines all the time, really know their stuff, from major British news outlets. And we've discussed these things in exactly the same terms as you and I are discussing this now. And there's very little in the way of argument. In fact, obviously, I get a great deal of my information from people like that. And I say, well, why don't you write / report this? And they say, it's just not the policy. We're very pro-Ukraine. We can't talk about this. They simply wouldn't accept these reports. And I'm certain that's the case for US outlets as well. So we're just not being told, for example, that every day, I haven't looked at today's readouts, but every day the Russians are pushing forward into Donetsk. Mm-hmm. Like you said, they've got most of Luhansk.
And I guess before the Russians taking of Avdiivka, it was said that it's kind of the last roadblock before they're able to, they were arguing it was a strategic point that they had to seize in order to be able to pivot beyond there and that kind of thing. And I'm not an expert of the Ukrainian war map. I know it's really frustrating that everybody relies on Kimberly Kagan and Jack Keane at the Institute for the Study of War for all the maps. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know whose map to trust, or if you can recommend somebody who's really reliable other than them.
I can recommend Willie OAM. That's WAILLY on YouTube. OAM. He's an Australian soldier. And what he does is Australian soldier, turned journalist, really capable, very interesting guy. Spent a long time in Ukraine. He collates the maps every day and describes to you exactly what's happening, both from the Russian and Ukrainian perspectives. He's very even-handed and a really excellent commentator. He takes roughly, I think, the same view as you about the ISW thing. So what he does is takes a step back, looks at the Russian maps, looks at the Ukrainian ones, matches them, and tells you what he thinks is really happening. And he's been bang on for the last few months that I've been following him. And Danny Davis also, I think, looks at him too.
Yeah, of course, the great Danny Davis. Now,
great Danny Davis.
So, well, I guess I hope you'll say the same thing about Odessa that you just said about Kharkiv, that, Putin doesn't want to bite off Odessa. Man, that would be way too difficult. But then I guess it depends on what time scale we're talking. You think he wants it?
Yeah. Colonel McGregor thinks that they'll end up with that. I don't think they'll want the trouble of crossing the Dnipro. But, what the hell do I know? I don't have my crystal ball. That might be one of those steps that Putin may not want to take because of this saber rattling by Macron about that. And it may well be that it's not really worth the candle. And obviously, if they were to take that, that would render Ukraine a rump state forever and probably result in eternal conflict, which may result anyway. I just think it would be not necessarily a step too far, but a step that Putin would not want to take for reasons of pragmatism, cost, and potential conflict with the West. It gets you close to Romania as well, which NATO would probably look kindly to. But Colonel McGregor thinks they will. I would tend to disagree, but there we have it.
No, I forgot what I was going to say, didn't I? Oh, yeah. And so Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah.
This brings us back to the question of NATO involvement, in especially the magical line crossed, right? The metaphysical line crossed, boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I guess special operations, MARSOC guys in sneakers get away with it, but once they're combat boots, and we got a real problem. And so Macron is talking about just dumping regular infantry in there. I know others have talked about, as you mentioned previously, putting trainers in Ukraine instead of training them across the line in Poland and that kind of thing. There have been reports in the New York Times and the Intercept and wherever from the beginning, from the Discord leaks, about special operations forces and intelligence officers from Western countries in Ukraine. But why don't you tell me everything you think you know about the presence of NATO forces there, and deniable and or not so deniable and the rest?
Right. So, as you pointed out, Discord and other places indicate that there are, I'll speak to the Brits. So Brits are very forward-leaning on us, as they would say, they crack on and all this kind of stuff that got us into the shit in Afghanistan. So they're always very forward-leaning and trying to improve. Candidly, I think what they're trying to do is impress the Americans with their willing. But there we are. That's generally the case with the British Army. Anyway, whatever the reason, there seem to be 50 or so UK special forces there now. What they're doing, who the hell knows? None of them have been caught yet or seen in combat. So there's that. Something, though, it's equally interesting, and I think could cause trouble in the medium term, is what was given away by the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff about 4 weeks ago, where they were having a conversation, the commander of the German Air Force and one of his subordinates, saying, well, we've been asked to provide Taurus missiles, which are cruise missiles, a bit like the British Storm Shadows. I would think, by the way, the British ran out Storm Shadows in the Libya campaign. I don't know that we built that many since, but I don't know. But it seems everyone's desperate for them and the German equivalent, which is Taurus. And what the German general said to his subordinate was, what we don't want to be doing here is do what the Brits do and put our own people into Ukraine and transport them in using British armoured vehicles like they do, according to him, and deploy our soldiers there, which indicates to me, and not only to me, that there are already, as you indicated, British and possibly French troops there helping with the targeting of these damn things, which of course makes them a target themselves. So that's the first thing. That's all I know about the deployment of regular troops there. Macron was quite interesting. I think his idea was he put a brigade of Foreign Legion in there, which would be the entire Foreign Legion. They use those, of course, because they're deniable. They can take casualties, and they're not so much, sorry, they're not deniable. They can take casualties, politically more expedient. But apparently what the French generals quite rightly said was, Mr. President, what do you propose to do with these troops? Do you also propose, therefore, to deploy the Air Force to cover them, which you're going to need to do, or you're going to trust the Ukrainians? No, they're not going to do that. So you're going to have an air component there. And that air component would then get challenged, of course, needless to say, by Russian aviation or Russian ground-based air defences. They'd have to be, because they'd have to conduct patrols over those troops to cover them if they're combat troops. And then, of course, they become a target. And that's what the general said. And then they said, how many troops do you think we've got, Mr. President? How many brigades have we got spare? How do we replace them? What do we do if there are casualties? What contingencies have you got for massive reinforcement? Are we going to declare Article 5 if they're attacked? And all these questions should be at the front of any silly politician's mind, waving their tin sabres around before they even utter a word about this thing. I mean, Cameron, who, by the way, Scott, you'll know this, that Cameron has a history of making promises. So he declared, I think, 2 weeks ago that we were going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. In 2011, he said we'd be in Libya as long as it takes. And most pointedly, in 2010, we'd be in Afghanistan as long as it takes. So Ukraine should start counting its silver if Cameron says things like that. But one thing, of course, Cameron did say is, as far as we're concerned, Ukraine can fire as many missiles it likes into Russia. The response to which was, as you can understand, yeah, and that's going to make you a target. So take that into consideration before you make promises like that, because we know your bases in Cyprus probably aren't that well equipped with anti-missile defences, but we're pretty well equipped with submarines and bases in Syria. So put that in your pipe and smoke it if you're considering using those missiles in our sovereign territory. So I think that message was received. And as far as I know, those British missiles have not been used in metropolitan Russia. But the fact they're even considering it, plus Macron's threats, says to me the quality of our leadership, in view of the conversation we had earlier about Cold War attitudes, is really, really poor. And the advice they're receiving, if they are receiving it.
Yeah. Well, we've been on this slippery slope thing, and this is sort of part and parcel of how childish our leaders are, but it's, I don't know. I guess, yeah, that is a big part of it. But essentially what they've done is, and they really talk about it out loud in the papers a lot, or the websites of the papers, that, well, they haven't nuked us yet. And we said we weren't going to give them tanks, and then we gave them tanks. And we said we weren't going to give them missiles with this kind of range, and then we did, and they still didn't nuke us. And we've been training them in huge numbers right there in Poland within range, and they're not firing their hypersonic missiles at us yet. And so I don't know, man, maybe we can push it a little bit further. They've been talking that a lot. And in fact, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when the war started, he said number 2 on his list of principles was we have to keep the war geographically contained inside Ukraine, meaning we'll help you fight for your territory, but we'll not help you fight across the line into theirs, because look at what kind of trouble that could get us into. And yet they have attacked over and over. And in fact, it's been neo-Nazi brigades leading the charge with, driving American armored personnel carriers, attacking Belgorod, and of course with drones. And somebody smart pointed this out. I wish I'd thought of it, but at least I can parrot it, that, a drone attack might look like a cruise missile attack on a Russian radar. Why should I assume that you understand everything the way I want you to? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
That they might launch on warning over a misunderstanding. What does the radar say again? Hit the enter button, the radar says the same thing again, and so we launch. Maybe.
Yeah, well, I suppose the question is, do you feel lucky? And obviously our leaders do feel very lucky. But, I was going to say good luck with that. And it's a bit more serious, isn't it? Because there'll come a point where luck no longer holds, and that the ratchet, you've just taken a step too far. And of course, there's some of those circumstances. They've been actively threatened. It's not like these are hypotheses or may happen. Or, it's conceivable that it might. They've actually been threatened. The idea of putting French or British trainers, or God forbid, some few dozen Estonian soldiers on the line to make a statement, and then Estonia, in its way, or Latvia or whoever it is, says, well, we've taken some casualties, we're going to declare Article 5 now. All this is well within the realm of possibility. And indeed, there's been no ratcheting down of any of these threats or supposed plans or flag waving or flag flying or whatever. It's just continually ratcheting up. And at some point, luck will fail. And either there'll be an attack causing casualties on NATO forces, or something worse by way of demonstration. And even if, as we said before, there's a 1% chance of that. Well, a 1% chance is just too much. And it wasn't a chance that our predecessors during the Cold War were willing to take.
Okay, but is there anyone, never mind in the press where we all can see, but, friends of friends, for a guy in your position, do you know if there's anything like these sorts of reasonable conversations taking place inside the British Ministry of Defense, within the intelligence services, whatever, that there's some realism here about, well, Joe Biden did overthrow the government there back 10 years ago. And you know what I mean? Just like a little bit of realism about what's going on here.
Well, the British Armed Forces are in such a state that I've no doubt at all they are. I mean, they can't, we've got probably 2 brigades that we could deploy anywhere, and we can't replace them. And I think we've got about 58 operational tanks. So even if all those other considerations didn't apply, we have absolutely nothing. We're very, very weak. And our generals know that, and I think they'll have been informing, which is why I think that there was no suggestion that the British send a brigade as well. Otherwise, if they had that stuff, they would do it. Because if you've got those toys, determinism indicates you're going to use them. We don't have them anymore. And I think everybody's aware of that. I can only speak for the UK.
Yeah.
And there are sensible people around that. And I suspect that's what's restrained the politicians. However, I will say one thing. I did hear a minister who just he resigned a few months ago on a TV programme, flying the flag for putting a British force in to do some training, which would amount to the same thing. Of course, they could become targets. And I think that sank pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. I mean, our country has enough trouble. I mean, we're wrecked anyway, economically and socially. We're in a pretty poor state. I think there'd be very little support politically for getting involved in this kind of thing, particularly in the sort of few months before an election here.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
Well,
so that's good.
So before, when you were talking about the deterrent effect of NATO, like in the Baltics, is one of the main reasons that Putin wouldn't try it is because he'd be picking a fight with NATO. I wonder if you're just thinking of nuclear deterrence at that point, or you think that Russia really would have a very hard time with NATO's, infantry on the ground there. Because, they just had to withdraw the Abrams tanks from Ukraine because they were always, basically designed politically with this ridiculous turbine engine and whatever. Andrew Coburn wrote about that in his book about Rumsfeld, 10 years ago or whatever. Everybody knew the thing was a turkey. And here they finally tried it out against the Russians and won them as a trophy in the Red Square right now. Yeah. So
I think they've done the same with the British tanks as well. They've withdrawn. And by the way, I think that the German ones have taken, they've taken, according to the Oryx site, which is really good on this, they confirm all the losses. It's taken 30, they've lost 30 of them, 30 the Leopard 2s. It's amazing. But to the point, I don't think any Russians be afraid of British involvement or French, except in the sense of the tripwire. But I think the really formidable ground forces now are Polish, Finnish, to a lesser extent Swedes, who are pretty close by.
And what about the Americans in Germany? Do they count too or not?
Oh, the Germans?
No, the Americans in Germany.
They don't have very large forces deployed. I think they've got a couple of brigades, which would make no particular difference. And then, of course, if it really got serious, they'd have to reinforce them across the Atlantic, and then we get into a much wider conflict with submarines and all that. So I don't think anybody would want to risk that. And I think that's where it gets wider, doesn't it? That if the US get involved, if they cross that line and get US troops involved, they'd be reinforced immediately. So what are you going to do with the reinforcements? Are you going to stop them in the Atlantic? Are you going to sink the ships? Are you going to attack the carriers? Are you going to have a go at the aircraft? And that's where things get really serious, when America gets involved, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Hey, y'all, let me tell you about Robertson Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Nobody trusts the U.S. dollar anymore. Foreign governments are stocking up on gold instead of $100 bills. One, they know they need to, and two, that means you need to too. Interest rates are up, but for some reason, not much for savings accounts. Park your money there and watch Uncle Joe Biden just counterfeit its value away. You can see how the Fed is afraid to raise rates to beat inflation for fear of popping the current bubbles, at least before the election. So more inflation it will continue to be. Gold is your shield against monetary and price inflation, just like it always has been. Now, Tim Fry and the guys over at Robertson Roberts are recommending gold over silver, since the world's almost 200 governments are putting their own pressure on the price, which should help everyone else who makes similar calls on their own. Of course, Robertson Roberts can help you with platinum, palladium, and silver, as well as gold. Don't let the Fed and the war party inflate all your savings away. Look up Robertson Roberts at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. Hey, y'all, you should sign up for my Substack. It's scotthortonshow.substack.com. And if you do that, you'll get the interviews a day before everybody else. But not only that, they'll be free of commercials. How do you like that? Pretty good, huh? scotthortonshow.substack.com. Hey, y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs, too. That's libertasbella.com. Now, you know, Trump and everybody else, too, the Republicans and the Democrats, obviously Trump makes more of a show of it, but they all complain that the NATO countries don't pay their fair share. You're supposed to all spend at least 2% of your GDP on your military forces so that we're not carrying that much of your weight for you, kind of thing. Yeah. And so I wonder if the reluctance of NATO states, at least in a previous era, going back 2 years, whether that reluctance to spend that much is just because they would rather spend it on other things, or if that was actually part of the strategy of not provoking Russia was, like, for example, the Germans, let's not arm up because we're just going to make Putin sweat. And why bother pissing him off when we don't have any real need to? And when I say the Germans, I guess I'm talking about Angela Merkel in that era, right? Yeah. And it was her policy to accommodate him. But was there, in other words, I remember Doug Bondo from Cato saying, notice the Germans aren't arming up. That's because they're not afraid of this Russian threat that the Americans keep hyping up. You know what I mean? They are more
Yeah.
realistic about it. But I guess I'm just wondering if you think maybe it goes a step further than that they didn't want to look like they were arming up either, because that's a bad look if there's no real reason to get prepared for war.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, but in the German case, they have so far to go. They say they're going to deploy a brigade again. We could talk about the brigade, but that's the unit at the moment that NATO uses to move around large numbers of troops. So they were going to and are planning to deploy a brigade in the Baltics, Latvia, I think, and the current projection is they'll be able to do that by 2026-27 to put 5,000 troops in Latvia because of all the logistical and duty of care and all that stuff. So they're in a very poor situation. I think they can barely put out enough aircraft to defend their airspace, despite having hundreds of them. Actually, to have them operational, ready to go, they've a handful. There was a review of German armed forces, I think, just before this phase of the war, which was truly embarrassing. But Germany has put 100 billion euros aside for its rearmament, the bulk of which, Scott, or the biggest single, the plurality of which, is going in to re-equip their nuclear delivery squadron, because the German Air Force has access to, if it's released by the Americans, nuclear bombs. So the Luftwaffe has a squadron of Tornadoes now, which are 50 years old. They want to replace those with F-35s. Good luck. And use those to drop bombs, or to be able to drop nuclear bombs on Russia. And they're spending 35 billion, I think, on that. So that's a big old chunk of cash. But when you come to Italy, Spain, and ask them, well, what are the threats to us, realistically? That's where you get these tensions within NATO, and you get the sort of highly aggressive, ancestrally hating Poles and Baltics and what have you, for very good reasons, arming up, coming armed to the teeth, to the point where Poland is now, by far, I think, the most formidable ground power. As against Portugal, which isn't really interested, understandably. But here's a power that's hardly ever mentioned, and is currently, possibly aside from Poland, the most formidable ground power and arguably air power in Europe, which is Turkey. We never hear about them. They're certainly the most powerful military overall in continental Europe. And certainly more powerful than us, frankly. The UK, arguably the French, Poles are coming up. They don't get any hassle at all, and they're not getting involved in this war either. They play both sides.
Yeah. I never did understand why Erdogan didn't sack Mosul after ISIS cleared the way for him.
Yeah. Yeah, they played a funny game there, didn't they? Especially when the consulate got kidnapped, which I suppose would be good cause for sacking Mosul. I think they could have done it any time. And then there was the fight in Ain Arab, wasn't there? Or what do we call it? Just over the border, with the army watching ISIS take on the Kurds. Yeah. Very interesting, the Turks. Really, really formidable. And they're not getting involved in this at all. And no one's saying a word about them.
Yeah.
A lot of complaints about the Germans or the Brits or whatever, but not the Turks.
Yeah. Hey, not to beat a dead horse that we already discussed, but I thought I wanted to bring this up before, but we got sidetracked on a different thing. But it was this New York Times article that you may have seen. The West doesn't understand how much Russia has changed, by Alexander Gabuev or something, from the director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin.
All right.
And he cites all these statistics about how, of course, it's a New York Times editorial, so the language is all very sanitary about why it's this way and whose fault it is. And boy, is this obviously not a good idea. You know what I mean? All that sort of sanitized out. But what he's really saying is, boy, did you guys succeed in kicking Russia out of Europe. Which, if you want to zoom out, maybe this is total overstatement, I don't know, but it's almost like kicking the Eastern Orthodox out of European Christendom civilization. That, like, you guys are Asiatics, go be Asiatic with the Chinese, and how there has been just this, I mean, he describes it more in economic terms, but he makes it sound like this permanent shift from the Russian point of view of looking toward the East and their trade with China and the rest of their Asian partners. And fine, if you guys don't want to be cool with us and we don't like that, they have really made the turn now. Biden, you done blown it all the way, or you succeeded in doing what you wanted to do, but it makes it sound pretty irrevocable, at least until what? America does a coup and puts a sock puppet in there? It doesn't sound likely to me,
No. Well, I've got quite a few Russian friends, and they're all anti-Putin. And I don't think they concur with that. There's ebbs and flows in history, and has been for the last 300 years that Russia's been involved since Peter the Great's time. And there's always this debate about how European and how involved Russia wants to be in Europe, and whether it considers itself European. No, so it's not. I don't think it's any of these sort of eternal judgments are always misfounded. But one interesting thing, there's a couple of interesting things which these guys always say. So one of the things is, be careful what you wish for the next leader. I think you've discussed that before.
Sure.
The likelihood is that they're going to be, from our perspective, worse than Putin. So enjoy Putin while it lasts is the point they make. The other point is it's a little bit more local. And it's really interesting. It really changed a bit of my perspective here and put into perspective the two-faced approach that the US had to Ukraine, never saying this. But all Russians believe, and you know this obviously, all Russians believe that Crimea is Russian, including Navalny. The sainted Navalny, said this on multiple occasions. Crimea is Russian, of course, which is it's a constituent part of Europe for a start. But look, Russia's a European. Is it, whether we like it or not? And obviously we don't now, but sometimes we do. Depends which part of which century you're in. Is a European power. It's also an Asiatic power. You don't just extract them like that. I think they're very well deeply embedded. Certainly in the UK, whether we like it or not, in our financial systems, and are likely to remain so. There are 100,000 Russians in London alone, as far as I know.
Well, I didn't realize the number was that high. But and also just they're huge, maybe the raw materials capital of the world, right? It's this massive chunk of northern Eurasia full of timber and oil and gas and whatever else you need. Fresh water.
Scott, can I offer you another article for examination,
Sure.
which I found just today? It's a CNN article, which you'll love, by that master of the military art, Ben Hodges, and Garry Kasparov. And the title is, and it's from May the 7th, so it's over a week ago. It says, opinion, this is CNN, this. The strategy is needed now before it's too late for Ukraine. I was just gobsmacked by this. And this is by Hodges, of course, really. I guess Kasparov will add input, but most of it's about military strategy. I thought, what kind of neck do you need to say that?
Yeah.
A strategy is needed now. Or maybe a strategy might have been needed, I don't know, February 2022, as opposed to let's hope for the best and rely on Ukraine's amazing and unique heroism to win it for us.
Yeah, we'll just lie and the truth will catch up. It'll be fine.
Yeah. It'll all be great. And because we're good, and we're the good guys, we're bound to. Even a couple of months ago, I think it was Hodges was saying the siege of Crimea has begun. Where do you on? Yeah, him and that other master and that other master of the strategic art, Petraeus, who still I think he's changing his tune now. But these guys, honestly, where are they coming from? And how do you have the sheer effrontery to write an article like that as a general?
Yeah. Well, back 10, 12 years ago, however many years ago now, a long time ago, 15 years ago, at the dawn of the American and NATO surge in Afghanistan, it was that same level. You could cite other examples too, but that same level of, just as we've discussed on the show, there's complete unreality about the ability of America, and I guess especially Britain, to remake Afghan society into the way we want it to be, and then set it, let it go like a top, and it's going to keep spinning, and it's going to stay the way we want it, and then we're going to get out someday. All we have to do is cure them with this counterinsurgency thing. I cite this in Fool's Errand, and I'll never forget this great article by Kelly Vlahos, I think possibly then for Fox News, or I guess for the American Conservative, about going to one of these meetings at the think tank, and you got all the civilian wonks, and you have all these arms contractors, and then all these military officers in their dress uniforms, and everybody's got their hair combed perfectly, and they're wearing their very best skirts, and they're whatever kind of thing, and it's like she's describing a scene from Society, right? It's not about the Afghans. It's about like who these people are in their little insular culture of people who agree about things and make money off this. Yeah. And there's just no good reason for anybody to pipe up and talk about how stupid this is.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned Cameron before, but they all said that. Afghanistan, we're curing it. We're going to cure it. We're going to make it our way. And like, quite frankly, I don't know why we didn't talk about this at the time it was all falling apart. I should have had you on the show then to talk about it. But that, really Trump and Biden's calculation that it's time to get out of Afghanistan, that really was nothing but them facing up to the truth. That we had lost that war, that it would have taken a major escalation to reverse the momentum in the Taliban's favor that had been going on for years at that point, that we were licked, and it was only when they were up against absolutely a steel wall and no way out that they finally admitted that they never said it, but essentially they admitted they were wrong all along. That it never coulda, shoulda worked at all, that Bush should have been out of there by Christmas 2001.
Yeah, and it's I think
Bin Laden was gone on the 17th.
Yeah, it's a habit of elites, though, isn't it? That it's okay. Next thing, well, anyway, it didn't work out. Next thing. I mean, this is the fear about Ukraine, though, isn't it? I mean, I think it was Hemingway said in one of his books, "The Sun Also Rises," or I think. Anyway, he said when collapse happens, it happens very slowly, and then it happens very quickly. And I know Danny Davis talks about this. He tends to think in those terms about Ukraine, but he's not wrong to present things in those terms. That's what happened in Afghanistan. It was collapsing slowly from when? 2010, maybe, 2001, I suppose, since the decision was made to stay. And then it happened very quickly. And that's the nature of collapse, isn't it? And but of course, you get in your helicopter and off you go. The government go to Dubai, settle into their condos, or London or New York or wherever, and with their cash, and everybody carries on, and it's next war. And you can honestly, to be candid with you, worst case, I can see something like that happening in Ukraine. We're shaping up for that because there's no strategic thought being applied to this. It's all hope and spin. And hope and spin is no way to run any kind of war, least of all one in Europe where hundreds of thousands of young men are being killed, and women and civilians every day.
See, that's thousands. The part that's so unbelievable. That was so much at stake that it's almost like you could say the war's being run by the PR men, right? Like this just it doesn't matter whether any of what they say is true, even though they're making the most important decisions maybe in all history based on these claims about what they're doing and how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, and naysayers are suppressed. I don't know if you saw that. Well, Stoltenberg has a sidekick. I can't remember his name now. He's Norwegian. And it's his either his EA or some very influential executive. It's number 2, was chef de cabinet or something. And he gave a talk more than a year ago now when things started to look as if they weren't going Ukraine's way. And he said, might be, and this was a public talk, you can find it. I wrote about it in The Guardian. And he said, might it be an idea for us to offer NATO membership to Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up territory? Now, look, you can argue about whether either of those things are wise or could ever happen. But the point was, he was saying really what sensible people should have been thinking for a long time, that maybe we should consider negotiations rather than slaughtering thousands of young men for no good purpose or for no gain. And it was stamped on immediately. It hasn't been referred to since. Nobody mentioned it. No, we carry on. There's no, we're not going to do that's out of the question. We're in it to win it. We're in it as long as it takes. Right, but what is it then? What is it that you're in it for to do?
Well, I mean, they did say over and over until they stopped saying it, that we're going to reclaim every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, and they've sort of dropped that, and they've they've admitted that now they just want to hold the line, but they clearly can't do that. You know, look, on the Atlantic Council side of this, right, if we're going to play war party here for a moment, they would say, come on, Frank, you just trust Putin. You think you could make a deal with him. All he's going to do is he's going to take the Donbass until he does want Kharkiv, and then he's going to take Kharkiv, and then he's going to take Odessa when he gets around to feeling like taking Odessa. And you think, what, we should just never draw the line anywhere and just let this guy do whatever he wants and become Vlad the Terrible and all of these things.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I already kind of pitched that to you before, but...
Right, but there's two responses to that, aren't there? So either we fight them forever, do we? And we just have a not even a frozen conflict. And the second one, which is a bit more practical, is to say, well, what we can do, of course, is to, if we don't trust Putin, is to apply some form of deterrence in there by arming Ukraine in some way that makes it highly unlikely there'd be any success, which wasn't done before if you're going to be kinetic about it. But either of those options are better than the continuing slaughter of thousands of young people every month, or at least discussing it, aren't they?
And you know, I kind of blew it because
it's a chicken hawk argument, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a chicken hawk argument.
Yeah. Although, you know, I kind of blew it because what I was really trying to get to there is, I think you did, you know, say earlier that you thought that it was realistic, that he really doesn't want Kharkiv. It ain't worth the cost of trying to bite that off. He really just wants what he's mostly already taken, which is the eastern 4 provinces. He wants to finish Donetsk, but he doesn't want to go the rest of the way to the Dnieper. He doesn't want to take Kharkiv. He doesn't want to take Kiev. And you think he's got his what he's bitten off so far, and maybe plus a little, is, in other words, if you were the diplomat and you made that deal, you actually do expect that he would keep that deal because you think that's within the realm of what he really wants.
There's no doubt. That's exactly, you put my point better than I could. I mean, the implicit in that is that there's never been any suggestion. And as Danny Davis says all the time, as you say all the time, they cannot take the whole country. They haven't, even now, with far stronger forces than they had at the outset, they cannot take, let alone hold, even half of the country. And the objectives are clearly Donbass, those 4, or the remains of the 4 provinces which they've annexed. But even then, so what Ukraine says is, and every Ukrainian, or most Ukrainians I speak to, they say exactly that. Well, you can't trust him, he'll try again. Fine, all right. Well, if you think that, make a settlement, or as a starting point, make a settlement on the worsening basis that it's getting worse all the time. Stop as soon as you can, and then ensure that it doesn't happen again by deterrence, by denial. Arm yourself up to make sure it doesn't happen again. Right? Now, I tend to think that's probably one way forward for the Ukrainians, which would hedge against the possibility, of highly unlikely, of the Russians trying to take Kiev. I mean, it's arguable whether they wanted to do that in the first place. Look who they sent on the initial invasion. The people in the vanguard of those units were Rosgvardia. They were the police, the military police. And why? Because they've been told that there wouldn't be any resistance and the army would collapse. And that didn't happen. That's one reason why they were seriously defeated. Mm-hmm. That indicates that they were expecting something that didn't happen. And they were not willing or able, with 180,000 people anyway, to take even a portion of the country, because that wasn't the plan. The plan was to knock over the government and come out. Mm-hmm. Now, for territorially, the only area they claim, it's very obviously Donbass, Zaporizhia, and that part of Kherson they hold already. There's no reason for them to take any more. Kharkiv would be impossible and silly. And if they do get involved in Kharkiv, that might be the end of them. That might be the mistake that turns the tide, because they'll get stuck into that meat grinder and be there for years. And I don't think the Russians want that in that hypothetical. But either way, the answer to that point, which is always made, we can't trust Putin. Okay, well, what dictator can you trust then? Are we proposing endless war? Is that the alternative that's proposed? some sort of war of attrition like the Israelis and Egyptians had for a few years, which cut the heart out of both of them, except carrying on for decades?
No, I'm afraid too many people would answer that yes.
Yes, they would. That's right. Yeah. As long as it's not your son that happens to be doing the fighting.
Yeah. And that goes back to the point that you were making at the beginning where you go, I don't know, man. Nightlife in Kiev right now is not too bad for a rich kid.
Or a rich kid. And there's plenty of those. One of my friends, her boyfriend was an artillery officer on the front. So he was an artillery spotter. It's a pretty dangerous job. And I said to her, Natalia, wasn't that? I could say, Natalia, I seem to be seeing lots of young, fit, strong young men riding around in this town by the thousand. And she said, some wounds you cannot see. So it's not as if I'm the only one noticing this. I think everybody's aware of that. About this is a poor man's war, And there are, don't get me wrong, there's some very brave, ordinary people, city people, middle class people, but equally, I know plenty of people whose sons are all abroad and they're all military age, and they're not coming back. And I don't see a militarized society in those urban societies. The militarization takes place in the poor, the villagers, who've never been to the city. And that asks other questions.
Yeah. Well, they don't even know enough to ask why they're fighting,
Right?
Some poor farmer. Same as it's always been, right?
Yeah, and then I was at the swimming pool in Kiev when I was there last time, and a person was with us, a medical type and a doctor, and he said, we take some of the wounded people to swimming pools and wounded soldiers. They've never seen a swimming pool. They don't know what it is. What's this blue water? Because as you know, the bulk of Ukraine is rural. By our standards, it's very poor, and it's very parochial. And we've got villages like that in England, actually, still not quite as poor, but very parochial. And they do what they're told. They do their best to defend their people, and they don't know. They wouldn't know what to do in a city like Kiev or Lviv or Berlin.
Yeah. In other words, they're as innocent as can be. They're just caught up in this thing by these chess players they've never heard of before.
That's right. And,
it's the same conversation. This is what you told me about the farmers down in the Helmand province. How they never even conceived. Oh, this was, and in fact, I think I saw the video of this where they're shown. Was it you that showed them, or you talked about? Somebody showed them a picture of 9/11, and they said, "Is that Kabul?" Yeah. They thought that downtown Manhattan might be Kabul. That's how they had never had any clue what world they live in.
No clue. What are all you guys doing here? Well, we're here because of what happened to the Americans in 9/11. What's America? It's a big country across the sea. What happened to them? Well, some Arabs flew some planes into some of their towers. Okay, then they'd say. So you are here because some people from a foreign country were attacked by people we've never met, who flew a plane which I've never seen into some houses and killed some foreigners that you don't know either. Is that why you're here? In a valley a long way off. And that's obviously, it goes, these people are as intelligent as anyone else, and they could do things you or I could never dream of, nor would be capable of. Yeah. They're not stupid. It's just their world.
Yeah. And look, it's not supposed to be an insult to the poor farmers of Ukraine, but just to say, as you said, they're very parochial. They live in a very small world, and they're conscripts here. They're slaves. And people just, like, for example, not to get too far into this subject, and I'm taking up probably too much of your time today, but...
No, it's a pleasure, as always.
There's so many civilians being killed in Gaza compared to whatever the ratio is to supposed Hamas fighters being killed. But here, mostly the civilians have somewhere to run to, and it's mostly fighting-age males in uniforms blowing each other up out there in the field. And yet, they're slaves on both sides. They're government slaves, conscript, draft armies of people who maybe some of them really are into it, but I think all of them must be presumed to not want to be there. and somehow their lives are forfeit just because they're a fighting aged male. It's okay to kill them with a drone or a bomb or a thing, on both sides, as you talked about. High tens of thousands at least on both sides killed in this thing.
Yeah. High tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands. I think. I mean, that's a low figure. That's the figure that can be demonstrated. Plus hundreds of thousands of injured who'll never get proper care and will languish away in their communities for the rest of their lives. And when you know what happens to our veterans, well, it's not good. What happens to them isn't going to happen to the Ukrainian ones. But I studied the First World War a lot. I had plenty of relatives in the First World War, and one of them's he was a poet, and he was a poor peasant. He was a peasant, family Irish background, essentially peasant background. And this guy was told and believed that he was going to Flanders or wherever, and went to all the theatres to fight for the rights of small countries. Being Irish, he thought, okay, that's good, I can go and do that. Of course, when he got there, he found out what was what, and we don't need to get into that. But I remember one time my grandfather saying that he came home, this extremely brave and very experienced infantry soldier, and was asked once, how was it, before he went away again to be killed. And he said, bearing in mind his background was rural Irish peasant, he said, if the Boche came over that wall there, I wouldn't lift a finger to stop them. He just couldn't describe how horrendous it was. But of course, when you do get to know through media, and you live in one of these cities, how awful it is and what the casualties are and what you can expect when you get there after 3 or 4 weeks training and being shelled all the time, then you may not be inclined to go when you're informed about what your chances are and what is likely to happen to you and what will happen to you if you get injured, which is to say you will be slung away, as veterans inevitably are in any country, but not given anything like the care, if you can call it that our veterans get. Then perhaps it isn't so appealing anymore.
Yeah, no, it's obviously a horror show, and for all the high-tech cameras in everybody's pocket, we don't really see the inside of the military hospitals over there or anything like that. We don't really see the reality of what is happening. I have seen a lot of pictures of a lot of newly greatly expanded cemeteries. I wouldn't know how to count them, but it's
I've met lots of wounded veterans over there, and very badly injured people. Some of them would like to go back, as soldiers do, and others of them simply can't speak to you. As it's the same for our Afghan and Iraqi vets here. Many of them wanted to go back and see to the enemy with no legs, and some of them don't want to talk about anything, and can't speak about anything because they're no longer able to speak. So they run that. I'm sure that spectrum applies for Ukrainian veterans as well. I would like to know what plans the Ukrainians have to look after their hundreds of thousands of injured veterans, and what funding Congress is going to supply for them. I don't see any enthusiasm for that kind of assistance to try and do something for the damage that's been caused to these hundreds of thousands of young people.
Now, some enterprising young lawyer needs to hook up the right hospital company with the special interest grift contract here to take care of these poor guys.
Yeah.
God. Oh, man. All right.
Linda Bill, sorry, but one other thing. When I wrote my book about Afghanistan, it's investments in blood, and I talked about the American costs. And as you know, it's $2 trillion. I spoke to Linda Bilms at Harvard, who was kind enough to give me an interview. And she said, look, by far the biggest cost of any war is the injured.
Right.
And she said, so for American troops, this was more than 10 years ago, and it's massively increased essentially. We estimate that the cost of just the injured, of looking after the injured for the next 50 years, will be in the region. This is 10 years ago, Scott, right? It's massively increased since then because of all kinds of factors. She had $800,000 million. So it's the biggest single cost. And of course, that's 100,000 injured. And many of them not very badly injured. Well,
yeah, and not just 800 billion, but 800 billion plus interest.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that
forever.
Was a low figure, by the way.
Yeah,
0.8 trillion.
Yeah,
but it's the single biggest cost, however you measure it.
Yep.
It's never budgeted for.
Yeah, and I don't know. I haven't really watched that much TV, but I think it's fair to say, as a rule of thumb, that The news doesn't show inside Walter Reed these days either. Nobody has to face up to what happened to American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, much less what happened to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, you know.
No. Well, that's not our problem.
Yeah. And so it will be in Ukraine, as you say.
Yeah, that's exactly how it'll be in Ukraine.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for getting in touch. It's great to talk to you. I really appreciate your time on the show and everything that you've done.
Always a privilege and a pleasure, Scott. Thank you very much, and good luck with all the work you do.
Thank you. You too. All right, you guys, that is Frank Ledwidge. He wrote, he's lieutenant commander in the British Navy intelligence there, and he wrote Investment in Blood and Losing Small Wars. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.